Welcome to Poddy, May 27th, 2026. A deep dive into filed bids. Here's a number that stopped me cold when I first read it. Nearly half of all preventable cancers worldwide trace back to just 2 habits. 2 out of the entire landscape of things that can go wrong in the human body: genetic mutations, environmental toxins, radiation, infections, metabolic dysfunction. 2 lifestyle behaviors account for roughly 48% of the cancers we actually have the power to prevent. And here's the tension that makes this genuinely interesting. The same study that delivers that striking headline also tells us very clearly that 2/3 of all cancers are not preventable at all. So we're living inside this uncomfortable paradox where we have enormous leverage over some cancers and almost none over others. And most of the public conversation collapses that distinction entirely. Today, we're going to pull that apart carefully. Let me set the stage with what we're actually talking about here. A landmark, large-scale study was published around early 2026. Nature covered it, and it's been widely reported since. The headline finding, as Nature framed it, is that more than 1/3 of cancer cases are preventable. The specific estimate is somewhere in the 37 to 38% range of all global cancer cases being attributable to what researchers call modifiable risk factors, things a person can, in principle, change or avoid. And within that preventable fraction, tobacco smoking and alcohol consumption together account for about 48% of those cases. So to be precise about the math, we're not saying half of all cancers come from smoking and drinking. We're saying that within the subset of cancers that are theoretically preventable, nearly half are linked to those 2 habits. That distinction matters enormously, and I want to make sure we hold on to it throughout this conversation. Here's what most people get wrong about this. When a headline says almost 50% of preventable cancers are linked to 2 lifestyle habits, a lot of people read that as, if you just don't smoke and don't drink, you're basically safe from cancer. And that is a genuinely dangerous misread. The study is very explicit that roughly 2/3 of cancers are not preventable and are not linked to lifestyle at all. Those cases are driven by things like random DNA replication errors, aging, hereditary genetic mutations, the biological noise that accumulates over a lifetime. So the full picture is, out of 100 cancer cases globally, maybe 37 or 38 are theoretically preventable. Of those 37 or 38, about 18 trace back to tobacco and alcohol. The other 62 or 63 cases, they're happening regardless of whether someone smokes or drinks. That is not a reason to throw up your hands. It's a reason to be honest about what prevention can and cannot do. Now, let me give you some background on why this research matters and why it's so hard to do well. Cancer is not one disease. It's a family of diseases, and the causes are genuinely heterogeneous. Some cancers are almost entirely driven by a single external exposure. Melanoma is a striking example from this study. Over 90% of melanoma cases were linked to UV radiation exposure. That is an extraordinarily high attributable fraction. It means that if you could somehow eliminate UV exposure, you'd wipe out most melanoma cases. On the other end of the spectrum, you have cancers like pancreatic cancer, or glioblastoma, where the modifiable risk fraction is much smaller and the biology is much harder to untangle. The challenge for researchers is building a methodology that can estimate, across all cancer types and across global populations with wildly different exposures and lifestyles, what fraction of cases are attributable to which risk factors. That requires enormous datasets, careful statistical modeling, and a lot of methodological humility. The CU's International Agency for Research on Cancer, IARC, has been producing this kind of attribution data for years through their Global Cancer Observatory, but the scale and rigor of this new study appears to represent a significant methodological update. So, what are the risk factors the study actually looked at? The full list includes tobacco smoking, alcohol consumption, high body mass index, infections, specifically things like high-risk HPV and H. pylori, ultraviolet radiation exposure, physical inactivity, and dietary factors. That's a broad sweep. And what the researchers found is that these factors don't contribute equally. Tobacco remains the single largest contributor globally, which honestly tracks with everything we've known since the 1950s and 60s, when the causal link between smoking and lung cancer was first firmly established. But tobacco's reach extends well beyond lung cancer. It's causally linked to at least 15 cancer types, including bladder cancer, kidney cancer, pancreatic cancer, and oral cancers. The carcinogenic mechanisms are well understood. The combustion products in tobacco smoke directly damage DNA, and repeated exposure overwhelms the body's repair systems. This is not a contested area of science. Tobacco as a carcinogen is about as settled as it gets in oncology. Alcohol is where things get a little more complicated in the public perception, because I think a lot of people still have this vague sense that moderate drinking is fine, maybe even beneficial, and the cancer data does not support that framing at all. IARC classifies alcohol as a Group 1 carcinogen. That's the highest classification, meaning the evidence of carcinogenicity in humans is unambiguous. Alcohol is causally linked to cancers of the mouth, throat, esophagus, liver, colon, rectum, and breast. The mechanisms are actually pretty well worked out. When your body metabolizes alcohol, it produces acetaldehyde, which is a toxic compound that directly damages DNA. Beyond that, alcohol causes oxidative stress, disrupts hormonal balance, which is particularly relevant for breast cancer risk, and impairs the body's DNA repair machinery. So, the biology here is not subtle. What's interesting is that the dose-response relationship for alcohol and cancer is roughly linear, meaning there isn't really a safe threshold below which risk disappears. Every drink adds some risk. That's a message that has been slow to penetrate public health communication, and I think this study is part of a broader effort to sharpen it. Let me talk about the infection piece for a moment, because I think it's genuinely underappreciated in the Western public health conversation. The study found that infections account for roughly 10% of new cancer cases globally, and the leading infection-linked cancer cause among women is high-risk HPV, human papillomavirus, which drives cervical cancer and several other cancers. Now, HPV vaccination programs have been one of the great public health success stories of the last 2 decades. In high-income countries where vaccination coverage is strong, we are watching cervical cancer rates decline in real time. That is remarkable. We are preventing cancer through vaccination at a population scale. But here's the thing. In low and middle-income countries, where HPV is more prevalent, screening infrastructure is weaker, and vaccination programs are less established, the infection-linked cancer burden is dramatically higher. H. pylori, the bacterial infection linked to stomach cancer, is another example. It's highly treatable with antibiotics, but if it's not detected and treated, it significantly elevates gastric cancer risk. The point is that for a meaningful chunk of global cancer burden, the intervention isn't about changing a behavior. It's about accessing a vaccine or a course of antibiotics. That's a structural problem, not an individual choice problem. Now, I want to spend some time on what I think is the most important implication of this research, and it's one that gets lost in the headline. The study identifies 10 specific cancer types where avoidable risk factors drove more than 80% of new cases. Melanoma, as I mentioned, is over 90% UV attributable. Lung cancer is overwhelmingly tobacco attributable. Oral and pharyngeal cancers are heavily linked to tobacco and alcohol combined. What this means for public health is that for these specific cancer types, prevention is not aspirational. It is the dominant strategy. The cost-effectiveness calculation here is stark. Sun safety campaigns, tobacco taxation, alcohol pricing policies. These are low-cost, high-leverage interventions for specific, high-burden cancers. And yet globally, we continue to concentrate the vast majority of cancer spending on treatment rather than prevention. My read on this is that the healthcare system's incentive structures are simply misaligned with the epidemiology. Treatment is billable, visible, and immediate. Prevention is diffuse, long horizon, and the benefits are invisible. You can't point to the cancer that didn't happen. Let's dig into the obesity piece, because I think this is where the story is heading over the next decade, and it doesn't get nearly enough attention. High BMI, body mass index as a proxy for obesity, is already listed as one of the major modifiable risk factors in this study. Obesity-related cancers include endometrial cancer, postmenopausal breast cancer, colorectal cancer, kidney cancer, and several others. The biological mechanisms are complex. Excess adipose tissue drives chronic inflammation, disrupts insulin signaling, elevates estrogen levels, and creates a pro-tumor hormonal environment. And here's the trajectory that concerns me. Global BMI rates are rising. The obesity epidemic is not slowing down. So even if the current study puts tobacco and alcohol at the top of the preventable cancer hierarchy, the relative contribution of high BMI is likely to grow over the coming years. One source I was looking at framed it as millions of deadly cancers every year could be prevented. And when you look at the list of exposures, high BMI is right there alongside tobacco and alcohol as a major driver. The question is whether public health systems will respond to this with the same energy they've directed at tobacco. I want to be direct about something that I think is crucial for how we talk about this research publicly. The finding that 2/3 of cancers are not preventable is not a footnote. It is load-bearing information. When you frame cancer prevention purely in terms of individual behavior, you implicitly suggest that people who get cancer made bad choices, and the data flatly contradicts that. The majority of cancer cases have no meaningful connection to lifestyle. They happen to people who never smoked, who drink moderately or not at all, who maintain a healthy weight, who do everything right. Cancer is partly a disease of biological randomness, of DNA replication errors that accumulate over decades of cellular division. The risk increases with age, not because people get lazier as they get older, but because the probability of an uncorrected mutation compounds over time. This matters for how clinicians talk to patients, how journalists frame these studies, and how policymakers design interventions. The goal is not to make people feel guilty. It is to identify the levers that actually move population-level risk, and those levers are primarily structural: tobacco taxes, alcohol marketing restrictions, vaccination programs, obesity prevention infrastructure. Individual willpower is a factor, but it operates within an environment that either supports or undermines healthy choices. Let me bring in a bit of historical context here, because I think it helps calibrate how significant this research is. The link between tobacco and lung cancer was first established in epidemiological studies in the early 1950s. It took another decade of fierce resistance from the tobacco industry, and a landmark 196/1964 Surgeon General's report in the United States before public health action started to follow the science. And even then, tobacco use remained widespread for decades afterward. The decline in smoking rates that we've seen in high-income countries since the 1970s and 80s is genuinely one of the great public health achievements of the 20th century, and it has translated into measurable declines in lung cancer mortality. So, the model works. Identify the risk factor, quantify the attributable burden, build the policy case, implement structural interventions, watch the population-level risk decline. But it takes time, often decades, and it requires sustained political will against well-resourced industries, with strong incentives to maintain the status quo. The alcohol industry, in particular, has been very effective at promoting the moderate drinking is fine narrative, and the cancer data increasingly undermines that framing. Now, let's talk about what this means for the clinical encounter, for the conversation between a doctor and a patient. One of the implications I find most interesting is the reinforcement of lifestyle counseling as a core component of cancer risk reduction. That sounds obvious, but in practice, primary care visits are short. Reimbursement structures don't reward prevention conversations, and clinicians often feel ill-equipped to have nuanced discussions about alcohol or weight with patients who didn't come in to talk about those things. What this research does is give clinicians a very precise, evidence-based framework for those conversations. You can now say, here are the specific cancer types where your risk is most modifiable. Here's the magnitude of that risk, and here is what the evidence suggests about how much risk reduction is achievable through behavior change. That is a different conversation than you should probably drink less. It's a conversation grounded in epidemiology, and it gives patients agency without manufacturing false certainty. The caveat, and I think this is important, is that clinicians also need to be equipped to have the structural conversation, access to smoking cessation programs, affordable healthy food, safe spaces for physical activity. Behavior change doesn't happen in a vacuum. Let me walk through the policy implications more explicitly, because I think this is where the research has the most direct real-world impact. For tobacco, the evidence base for policy intervention is extraordinarily robust. Tobacco taxation is one of the most cost-effective public health interventions ever studied. Price increases reliably reduce consumption, particularly among young people who are price-sensitive. Graphic warning labels, advertising restrictions, smoke-free public spaces. These have all been shown to reduce smoking rates at population scale. The WHO's Framework Convention on Tobacco Control has provided a global template, but implementation varies enormously by country. For alcohol, the policy toolkit is similar. Minimum unit pricing, which sets a floor price per unit of alcohol, has been implemented in Scotland and parts of Canada and has shown measurable reductions in alcohol-related harm. Marketing restrictions, particularly around advertising to young people, are another lever. For HPV, the policy case for expanding vaccination programs globally, especially in low and middle-income countries, is now even stronger given this data. These are not speculative interventions. They are proven tools with a documented track record. The question is political will and resource allocation. One thing I want to flag as genuinely worth watching, and this is more of a methodological observation than a policy point, is the direction that this kind of research is heading. The study we've been discussing represents a significant update to prior global cancer attribution estimates, but it's still working at a relatively aggregate level. What I find compelling is the trajectory. As genomic datasets expand, as epidemiological cohorts grow larger, and as computational methods get more sophisticated, the next generation of these studies will likely be able to disaggregate the preventable fraction with much greater precision. We're talking about country-specific estimates, income stratified estimates, cancer subtype-specific estimates. That level of granularity would be genuinely transformative for public health policy. Right now, a country like India, or Nigeria, or Brazil has to apply global averages to their specific cancer burden, which may not reflect their actual risk factor distribution. If future research can say, in this country, with this income profile, the leading modifiable risk factor for this specific cancer type is X, that enables targeted quantified prevention goals. Think about it like the cardiovascular disease model, where we have specific time-bound reduction targets. That kind of precision is plausibly where cancer prevention policy is heading. Now, let me give you the prediction I think is most worth sitting with. And I want to be clear, this is pattern matching from the research signals, not a certainty. Based on the rising global BMI trend and the growing body of evidence linking obesity to multiple cancer types, I think there is a plausible trajectory where high body mass index overtakes alcohol as the second largest modifiable cancer risk factor within the next decade. The math is fairly straightforward. Tobacco rates are declining in most high-income countries. Alcohol consumption is relatively stable, but obesity rates are rising almost everywhere. And the cancer types linked to obesity, endometrial, colorectal, breast, kidney, are among the most common globally. If that trajectory continues, the public health messaging around cancer prevention will need to pivot significantly. We'll be talking about metabolic health, insulin resistance, chronic inflammation, adipose tissue dysfunction, with the same urgency that we currently reserve for tobacco cessation. That's a major cultural shift, and it will require a very different kind of policy toolkit than the one we've built for tobacco, because the drivers of obesity are deeply embedded in food systems, urban design, economic inequality, and stress. It's a harder problem, but the cancer data is pointing us directly at it. Here's the contrarian take I want to leave you with, because I think it's important, and it genuinely doesn't get enough airtime in these conversations. We have spent decades and enormous resources building the scientific case for modifiable cancer risk factors, and that work is valuable. But there is an argument that by focusing so intensely on the preventable fraction, we have actually underfunded research into the non-preventable fraction, the 2/3 of cancers that are driven by biology, not behavior. We don't fully understand why certain cells undergo malignant transformation. We don't have good early detection tools for many of the deadliest cancers. We don't understand why some people with identical risk factor profiles develop cancer and others don't. The preventable cancer story is important and actionable, but it can create a false sense that we have the problem figured out. We don't. The majority of cancer cases are still happening for reasons we can't fully explain or control, and that should be driving at least as much research investment as the prevention agenda. The two things are not in competition, but the framing of "we know how to prevent cancer" can inadvertently crowd out the harder, messier, more expensive work of understanding the biology of the cases we can't prevent. Let me pull this together. What we've covered today is a landmark study that gives us the clearest picture yet of where preventable cancer burden actually comes from. The headline is striking. Tobacco and alcohol together account for roughly 48% of preventable cancer cases. But the more important number, in my view, is the one that says 2/3 of cancers are not preventable. Both of those numbers matter. The first tells us where to focus our public health resources: on tobacco control, alcohol reduction, HPV vaccination, sun safety, and increasingly on metabolic health and obesity prevention. The second tells us to approach cancer with humility, to resist victim-blaming narratives, and to keep investing in the basic science that might eventually unlock the cases we currently can't explain or prevent. If you want to dig deeper into this, I'd encourage you to look at the original Nature coverage from February 2026. Explore the UHO's IARC Global Cancer Observatory data and look at the specific literature on alcohol as a Group 1 carcinogen, because I think that's the area where public understanding is most out of step with the science. The research is clear. The communication gap is real. Here's where I land on this. The fact that we can trace nearly half of all preventable cancers to two specific habits is not a reason for optimism or pessimism on its own. It's a call for precision. Precision in how we design interventions, precision in how we communicate risk, and precision in how we allocate research funding across the full spectrum of cancer, preventable and not. The studies will keep getting better. The datasets will get larger. The attribution models will get more granular. And if the trajectory I described plays out, where future research can give us country-specific, income-stratified, cancer subtype-specific prevention targets, we will have tools for cancer prevention that are genuinely analogous to what we have for cardiovascular disease. That would be a genuine turning point. We're not there yet, but this study is a significant step in that direction, and the 2/3 of cancers that remain unexplained are the frontier that should be keeping oncology researchers up at night, and frankly, keeping all of us a little humble about what we think we know.